Well, we're coming up on our 10:30 thing here pretty soon. Well, it's now 10:30, so it's time for brainstorming the human connection, brought to you by South Dakota Humanities Council. And we have with us today uh, Julie Breu, sometimes known as my bro, but uh, Julie Breu is with us, and she's from the Lake County Museum. And the Lake County Museum, well, I'm going to let her talk about all of that. I'm just repeating it. But and she's going to do a much better job than I would have ever done. And the reason we're going to talk about the Lake County Museum is that they have a unique program, an interactive program. And we'll talk a little, have Julie and Christina and Jack, who's also with us. Christina, that you see on the screen, she's from the museum, as well as Jack Weck. And they will be accompanying Julie in talking about that. But the reason we're talking about it is because museums are one of our underutilized resources. You know, people often talk about what they don't have. It's amazing how much stuff we do have that people just aren't using. You know, I hear people say, "Oh, it's boring in South Dakota." No, it's not boring in South Dakota. You're boring because there's lots of things here to do. You know, but if you're not doing them, if you're not going to the place, if you're not engaged, if you're not interacting with museums, then yeah, your life is going to be dull. You know, but that's not really because there isn't things to do. It's because many people aren't doing them, and many people are doing them because they just don't know about it. They're not aware of what museums do and what is possible. Sometimes it's because museums do a kind of a poor job of letting people know all the things that they don't see that's available to them, you know. And so we can't do all of that today. We can't cover it all, but we're going to try to cover some of it so that you get an idea of the kinds of things that not only the County Museum has to offer, but museums in general. They're amazing institutions, and the people who run them, they are amazing people as well. You know, they're kind of, you could say, kind of physical librarians in a way, you know, because they have like physical libraries of things, and you could take one of those objects and people can tell you a whole story, and you can see the objects. Things kind of can come to life in a museum. At least that's how I see museums, is that there are all of these potential adventures in every artifact in a museum. There are stories. And if you can get into those stories, if you can find the stories behind the stories, I think you will find that life in general, and South Dakota in particular, for this conversation, is not boring at all. So with that, I'm going to introduce Julie Breu. How are you doing today, Julie?
Good, thank you. Thank you, Lawrence, for having us on the program today. I'd also like to thank the South Dakota Humanities Council for granting us the money to take our 1880s claim shanty from a static exhibit to an interactive exhibit and be able to discuss the various aspects of prairie life and homesteading and coming to Lake County in the 1870s and 80s, and how that affects us today. So I'll just do a quick introduction of myself, and then I'll introduce the folks who are with me today. Like I said, my name is Julie Breu. I've been the director of the Lake County Museum since 2020. My husband and 2 teenage children, we've lived in the Madison area since 2000. Before coming to this museum, we had spent 5 years in Europe for my husband's job, and we left the States in 2013. But before that, I worked at the Siouxland Heritage Museums for 15 years as operations manager and the collections curator. So I have a lot of different experiences with museums, local and regional museums. I've also worked at Flandreau and Pipestone and New All museums. So, and of course, traveling in Europe, I've seen a lot, and I've also volunteered for some museums over there. So I'm excited to be here today. And I'm going to introduce you to our community program coordinator, who was also funded through South Dakota Humanities ARPA grant. So she's made a huge impact on our programming today. Her name is Christina Blessinger. Christina, go ahead and introduce.
Hi, I'm Christina Blessinger, and as Julie said, I'm the programming coordinator for the Lake County Museum. I get the fun job of bringing programs, workshops, lectures, events to the museum. I'm originally from Valley Falls, Kansas, so I grew up in the northeast part of Kansas, and I moved to South Dakota about 22 years ago. 20 of those I've spent in Madison in Lake County. I've enjoyed pursuing careers that interested me over the years. And so before moving here to the museum, I was an art teacher, an elementary art teacher at a local school. I was also a small business owner, and I had an art studio for children. And so before coming here, I had that education experience. Elementary education and art studio. I've always loved when I would teach in my art classrooms. I love to focus on art history, and so I have a natural love of museums, reading history books, teaching history in all of my classrooms, my studio. So it's a natural fit. I love what I do here. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Christina. Go ahead, Julie. One second.
would-
If you have your mic
Okay.
on and you're not talking, not you, Julie, would you please turn your mic off, because we're getting some sounds that have nothing to do with the program. It may be
Okay.
background
Can you-
noise.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine, but
Okay.
there's one microphone that's on. I'm not
Okay.
sure which one, that have nothing to do with the program, but they have people talking in the background,
Yeah.
so that's a bit distracting.
Thank you.
You bet.
I'd like to introduce our a fantastic volunteer. He's been with us for over a year, Jack Weck. And I will let Jack tell you all about himself.
Hey folks, Lawrence, thanks again for having us on the program. It's exciting to be here and to be able to present to people what we do and how we practice our craft in the museum industry. And I'm originally from Illinois. I was born and raised in Illinois, spent many years there except for military service. And along the way was fortunate enough to be able to help out the Illinois State Historical Society and the Elgin Academy Archive and the Elgin Area Historical Society Museum and a couple of other places. And here in South Dakota, which we traveled to basically follow our grandchildren to Dakota State University, give them a plug. And it's been an interesting experience. And when I was updating my resume, trying to brush off the dust a little bit, and I enrolled in an online archival course, and I found a fellow alum from Eastern Illinois University Historical Administration program, who happened to be Julie. And so she invited me to volunteer at the museum, and here I am. And the one thing I wanted to pitch a little bit is when folks go to museums in their local communities, or sometimes even in major cities, it's important to note that over 80% of people in the museum industry are volunteers and are not trained in the industry. They have a very strong interest in history, and a lot of them are experts in their field, but they aren't necessarily through a formal set of educational processes like Julie went through. And on top of that, it's also very, it's very unusual to have a museum director with international experience like we have here in Lake County. So that's a great benefit to us, and you can tell the museum is becoming quite an exciting place to be a part of.
Great. Well, now that we know all of you, we hope that you'll join in this conversation. I want to point out that you have an interactive museum and have a little discussion about that. We have lots of interesting things, by the way, that we're going to be talking about, one of which is the interactive museum. And I believe, Christina, that you're kind of focused on that. So could you talk to us a little bit about that and
Sure.
what it's about?
Sure, thanks, Lawrence. So our newest exhibit is the claim shanty, the 1878 claim shanty, which you'll see behind me. Thanks to a South Dakota Humanities Council grant, we were able to turn what Julie had already mentioned as a static exhibit into an interactive exhibit. We have the grand opening next Tuesday evening, and so we're going to have a South Dakota Humanities lecturer come, and she's going to discuss women homesteaders, women who, settled their own claims, and we'll have the shanty open. The exhibit will officially be open at that time. We've got a variety of interactive elements to the exhibit. We have display cases which feature original artifacts from original homesteads in the area. The shanty itself, we've outfitted with replicas when we can, a stove, things that kids and adults alike can touch and interact with. We have made, I think Jack already showed the hay twists that we've made. I have the original hay twist from an 1878 claim shanty, and we used raffia to make pretend hay twists that guests can, see what it was like to stoke a stove and heat a shanty and to cook. We have clothes, a lot of what I do personally is field trips, getting children from the schools here, from the community. So they'll be able to come in and see really what it was like to dress as a pioneer, live in a really small shanty, what it would be like. I learned how to tie a rope bed. That was a new experience. So we did get hold of a rope bed and tied rope, and we stuffed a mattress with hay. So we have an original, what would be like an original rope bed in our shanty. We have pretend food, lots of hands-on experience in the shanty itself, as well as panels that our guests can read and learn firsthand accounts from the pioneers who did settle Lake County. Just really hands-on, step back in time.
One of the things that's interesting about an interactive museum is engaging more of the senses, because often we think of museums as just something that we look at. Can you talk a little bit about the engagement of the other senses in the museum experience and why that might be important for the museum goer?
Yeah, I can talk briefly to this. Julie has more experience here, so I'll pass it to her when I'm done here. But I was just telling Julie, I was reading a New York Times article about engaging people, and is the new museum model where things are hands-on and interactive, is that better than the old, things in cases with tags and explanations. And I don't know that there's really an answer to that, but I do think one of their defenses is we used to have museums for people had a natural interest. They wanted to come and engage with the exhibits as they are, just behind glass, read the information. And I think in the cultural, I think the culture now, you know, everything's electronic, everything's hands-on, it's instantaneous. I think as a museum, we have to invite people to be engaged. They're not coming in naturally interested, wanting to read a bunch, wanting to see things behind glass. They want to interact and they want to explore. And that's how we're going to draw them in. And so, yeah, the sense is, you know, the shanty alone, we have the hay twists, you know, that they can put in the stove. We have signs around the museum. We have artifacts, a rotary phone that guests can that's been fun for Julie and I to see kind of the age, you know, where do people know how to use, what age cutoff is that, you know, how old are people that know how to use the rotary phones? And so far, I think we've determined there's a lot of high school kids that come in and they're still kind of learning how to use that rotary phone. We have Polaroid cameras, we have things that they can touch and interact with. And it draws them into the exhibit because once they're trying out that rotary phone, well, it sits on a case that has lots of other, you know, old technological devices, and they're reading about those, and it's engaging them without knowing they're being kind of drawn into that exhibit. So as far as programs, when we do programs and events, we work in a craft element to our programs. So it's hands-on. The kids are taking home something that has to do with the topic we're learning about that day. We always have treats. We usually try to have the treats also. So they're eating, they're touching, they're creating, they're making messes. And I'm talking specifically to children at this point, but the museum itself, we have lots of interactive exhibits for all ages. Julie, if you want to add.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lawrence, you're right. We experience life through all of our different senses. And when people come to the museum or a museum, they want to see the quote unquote real thing. We'll have kids in, and I've had this many, many times, and they'll be looking at an artifact or an original document, and they'll say, is this real? And meaning, is this from that time period? And we, as people and with objects, we connect. You know, there's that energy connection. But then there's also, like Christina was saying, the aspect of touching things, experiencing that, trying it out yourself, whether you're cranking butter by hand or using a pen for calligraphy. But also the sense of smell, and that's what's come into a lot of museums as well. With the clam shanty alone, you know, I was thinking we could do like scent boxes. This is the smell of the hay twist burning. This is the smell of, you know, something cooking. We could even do what the cow pies smell like, you know, and people like that. It's kind of it's an interesting experience. And one of my favorite, I actually have two favorite experiences that took that museum experience to the next level. One was at the, it was at a museum, and it was about Napoleon and his army, and it was, you were in this theater, and it was a film, and as the horses came through, you could feel the horses, the vibration of the horses. So it was very highly technological, but it gave you that sense of, yep, there's horses running by. You could smell the smoke from the campfires. Another museum, it was World War II at Bastogne in Belgium. And the part of the interactive was they were talking about how cold it was during their campaign. And so they dropped the temperature in the theater, and you could see your breath. They dropped it that low. And so just museums are being very, very creative about how to engage those other senses. Sometimes it works, and I'll say sometimes it doesn't work. So Jack, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, actually I do. I mean, I think we've all found, as we work in various museums over the years, I think one of the things that's stuck in my head is that people, when they come into a museum for an experience, and it's really informal education that we're providing. So for instance, if you're interested in looking at the 1878 covered wagon that Julie's in front of, you can do that. But if you're not into wagons and instead you'd rather look at something else, another exhibit, maybe you're into textiles like dresses, or maybe you like tools or something like that, you don't have to look at the wagon. You can go to another exhibit. And children as well as adults, I think, are really interested in things that they can relate to as human beings, things that relate to their life. And so, for instance, Christina's in the claim shanty, and inside the claim shanty is a period rope bed. Obviously, the ropes are reproduction, but the bed itself is an actual artifact. And people are amused to hear sometimes, these old sayings, like most of us have probably heard the saying, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. Well, that refers to a rope bed, because when you sleep on a rope bed in the morning, it's probably sagging a little bit because of the weight, and you have to retighten it before you use that bed again. And so there's some of these quaint sayings that survive over centuries, literally, and they sort of lose their connection. But that would be one that people could relate to. And I think people are interested in just basic things like, well, how did people cook? What did they eat? What was the diet of someone who lived in a claim shanty? Because they had to prove up over the course of several years. And what about the people who traveled west in covered wagons? Well, how did they eat? When did they stop? What were some of the things that they encountered? And they're fascinating stories out there. So that's, I invite everyone to come to a museum. I'm very excited about museums. I think artifacts of the past can really inform our decisions for the future. And I think a lot of times people lose their sense of history, and they also lose a sense of perspective. And on a global scale, you can see that in invasions of countries, or horrible things that have happened throughout American history and global history. And I get on my high horse because I'm a retired teacher. I recently came from Illinois, and I was an adjunct history teacher at Lincoln Land Community College in Springfield, Illinois, in the state capital. And all things Springfield, there are folks down there that know what poor Lincoln had for breakfast, but every day, because they study him so much. But South Dakota's got fascinating history. I mean, I recently came back from the Black Hills, and I'm really impressed with the Native American history that was presented out there. And there's some phenomenal museums in this state too. And as Lawrence says, you got to get out and interact. You can't just sit home. There's lots of cool stuff out there. So don't be boring.
Yeah, don't be boring. Exactly. So, and speaking of that, one of the things that can enhance a person's personal value is actually having those kind of museum experiences. And it's because as you do, you actually change, because there's something grounding about, for example, just picking up those twisted hay things and smelling those hay things. You have a certain sense of more, let's say, groundedness, because you actually, oh, I do know that thing. I know it in a different way now, and or you take, for example, that rotary phone, just knowing that, oh, it wasn't always this way, and your link to it and seeing the link from that. And just to put in a plug here for South Dakota, especially since you mentioned telephones, a lot of people don't know that South Dakota had the first telephone exchange in the world. They don't know that. And I found it out in a book that has to do with all about data and the importance of data. And there was a section in there that talked about how the farmers and housewives created the network by hooking up this newfangled telephone thing to the barbed wire. And all those barbed wire things all hooked up each farm, everybody, up to one guy's property line, and he took the post and went to another one. And there was even a comment that he pulled from the local newspaper about a minister who had written a column that saying basically that the world's going more or less to hell in a handbasket because wives are spending all their time on the telephone and not getting any work done because they're on the darn phone all the time. Why does that sound familiar? So I think drawing those, using the artifacts to draw those kind of connections so that people can more easily see their connection to the past and to those inventions and things that they didn't just pop up. It wasn't like this phone fell out of the sky from a spaceship and then people start duplicating it. There's a transition that happens, and there's a connection to everybody. I think that's one of the values of museums. But let's talk from your points of view. What do you find the role of museums or the value of museums to be?
I can start. Of course, I'm of course very invested in museums, and I find them very valuable. Like Jack alluded to earlier, we are considered informal educators. Schools, universities, high schools, middle schools, elementaries, that's formal education. But as informal educators, we do keep in mind the school standards, like the state history standards, so that we can work hand in hand with teachers to help them elevate their plans, their lesson plans, and elevate the students' understanding of that time period. Museums, like I said, connect people. And like you said, Lawrence, you get that understanding. The phone just didn't fall out of the sky. And in local museums connect us regionally, statewide, nationally, and globally. Everything kind of can come down to the local. It's just not, oh, that happened in China or that happened in Illinois. I mean, yes, we have a lot of things here in South Dakota and Lake County that relate to that outside world, and that happened because of that. And we're instrumental in showing the primary documents, the original artifacts that connect us locally to the global humanity and activities and things that have happened.
So there are, Christina, did you want to add anything to that?
Julie covered it perfectly. From the programming standpoint, I think just bringing artifacts to life a little bit. I think history becomes so removed at some point, it almost becomes a myth, and they don't realize that things are real, the stories are real, the people actually existed. And so we have a unique opportunity, as Jack already mentioned. We're on the Dakota State University campus. And so we've had a lot of opportunities, even in just the last few weeks, discussing technology with, Dakota State is really focused on cyber issues, computers, technology. And a PhD student came through a couple weeks ago and was discussing, we have an Oldsmobile on the floor, a 1920s Oldsmobile on the floor here. And he is talking about cyber ethics and how safety for that Olds, you know, nobody was hacking their computers like they would a Tesla, and how safe is a Tesla, you know, and we had this whole hour-and-a-half conversation about technology and how safe it was back then versus now, and was it truly safer? And we've opened up a whole dialogue about how he and I might work together to bring an interesting exhibit relating old technology to new technology to the museum and to campus. But one of the first things he said was the covered wagon. When he saw the covered wagon, he said, I've never actually seen one in real life, just in the movies. And I could tell it really brought everything else in the museum. It made it real. And I think that's our job, is just to continue the stories and continue passing that down, you know, making it important, and showing kids that it's the real people and real artifacts, and this is where we came from.
That's so important to say, Christina, that, you know, it's easy when we hear so many other things that are really mythical. They're just sort of made up stories to aggrandize or make someone seem important. There's a lot of that, too much of it in what we call history. But when you can talk about what ordinary people were doing, not some person who would just basically, you know, one of my pet peeves is Alexander the Great. He was a juvenile delinquent messing with people in a grand way. He wasn't just like, you know, messing with somebody's neighborhood. He was killing whole countries. You know, it's like, well, why are we talking about this guy when we could just sum up by saying he was a sociopath, when we're not talking about what did people, everyday people like us, do? What were they doing? What were their lives like? What were those bed bugs about? You know, talk about those things. Maybe have some pictures and, like, you know, with, you know, a piece of flesh in the mouth, you know, whatever they're doing. But like, let people know that these are real things. It's not something that's made up. It's not like, you know, telling stories about monsters that people made up in their minds because they didn't know what an octopus was, you know. So those things, and feeling it and seeing it, having that context is really important. That said, it hasn't always been that way with museums. Can you guys talk about the history and transitions of museums, and, you know, at least a 50,000-foot view of how they have transformed and into what they are today, and what are some unique things that you used to didn't get?
Okay.
Well, some of the, yeah, this is an interesting, I'm sorry, go ahead, Julie. This is an interesting story because museums have evolved in a pretty serious fashion. And museums in Europe are also different than museums in the US. In the US, if I have a collection of, you know, cowbells, let's say, and I want to start a museum, I can do that. In Europe, it's under state control, and the curation and the collection have to be approved. And sometimes that's put to great political advantage, depending on the nature of the country. And, you know, let's face it, we're all citizens of South Dakota, which means we're global citizens. We're connected to people in Ukraine and in Austria. I myself have family members. My oldest daughter lives in Austria, in Vienna, very near the Museums Quarter, fascinating place. And so as a public historian, you have to be sensitive to the fact that museums provide us with our sense of place, but our history gets skewed, it gets mythologized, and a lot of voices end up being swatted aside. And I've had students ask me, well, why is it important to hear, you know, to include the diary from the housewife in 1870 when there's already so much information out there? And, you know, the discussion usually evolves, and people tend to agree that her story isn't as important as anyone else's story, because you can't tell the complete story without including everyone's voice. And so museums originally started out as political slash specific interest institutions, and then evolved over time. And in the US, museums have had a really interesting history. I mean, you can go out and find historical markers commemorating various things. Some of them are very politically incorrect by today's standards because they were erected almost 100 years ago or more. Some of them will skew your thoughts. Historic house museums tend to be representative of this. Usually it's the local mansion, and you'll hear all about the guy who owned the factory and had all the money, but many times you won't hear about the workers, or in the American South, the enslaved workers, or the people who did the cooking, or kept the grounds and the animals. You won't hear about labor strikes, labor troubles. You certainly hear very little about the thread of life, like childbirth and sexuality and death. Death, I think, is probably the most taboo subject in most museums. But it's interesting. I've actually been asked to leave tours because I've asked some pointed questions. I think it was in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I got thrown out of a historic mansion. Not thrown out, but I was gently asked to leave. And y'all asked too many questions. And you can't. It's unfortunate, but people mythologize olden times. And when you come through a museum and it is interpreted to an extent where the docents are telling visitors that the enslaved workers or even the paid staff were treated just like family, it's like, no, they weren't. I mean, but that's what they do, and they'll show you the fancy furniture and the nice cutlery and the plates and all those things are great. But history needs to inform. We can't gloss over those things. And so I get on my high horse, but
yeah, I can see you're passionate about it. And I would say too that they might have treated them like family, but we don't talk about how they treated the family. Maybe they. Yeah. I want to take a quick break to introduce someone that I saw just signed on, Abigail Rosebottom. She's one of my favorite people now. And she's one of the museum people from the South Dakota the State Art Museum. She's a community outreach person there. So I'm glad that Abigail had a chance to join us, because she may have some interesting insight too in the direction that we're going, and that is talking about what can museums be now? Where is the future? What are the kinds of things that museums can do now, especially with, we have certain technologies that we didn't have, not only electronic ones, but we have like blues that we didn't have that allow us to restore things in a way that we couldn't before. We have means of hanging and displaying things that we didn't have before. We have means of telling stories that we didn't have before. We have artifacts that we didn't have before. So I'd like to open it up to all of these museum people to talk about where do we go from here? What are some of the things that we now have in ways to tell the stories using all the senses and all of that we didn't have before, and where do you see it going? You can all speak in it together, but make sure that you have it in harmony, preferably in C# minor.
There you go. I would say, I'll start it off by saying the basis of everything we do as public historians is we have to make sure that everything is based on rigorous academic research In other words, we have to tell people the real deal. Now that evolves over time, but if you have documentary evidence, photographic evidence, archaeological evidence, things like that, oral histories come into play in many cases. And if you base your museum exhibits on that, then the rest can be enhanced with technology and with the various things that come to mind, community outreach, etc. But I think, you know, one of the really important things to remember is we have to tell it the way it was. We can't sugarcoat it. We can't gloss it over. We can't mythologize it. That's not our job. So if someone comes through our exhibit and is a little bit uncomfortable with a certain aspect of it, that's fine. We made our point. So I'm sure Christina and Julie and Abigail and whoever else is out there can add to that, but I think that's important for us to remember.
I'd like to add to what Jack said. I think museums today are becoming more of the community connection for conversation about the past and how we did get to where we are today. Our job is also to interpret the past, but we do have to be careful of which lens we look through. We can't judge everything from the past with our understanding and our lens of today. People have evolved over time. History there's ebbs and flows to it. But yeah, I think through like the Zoom, other technologies, that we can begin that local community conversation, but then also we can go statewide or globally with it. But the museums of today are changing to be that community, truly trying to include everyone, not what it once was, the showplace of perhaps the wealthy, the historic mansions. Oh, come and look at my collection. But yeah, it's a collection that's fantastic, but who wants to see teacups from all over the world? It's interesting, but what does that mean to me? How does that affect me here in Madison and Lake County? So I think that we are really trying to connect to the everyday people. You know, the history's not just about the famous and wealthy. It's about people who lived in the claim shanties. And, you know, there's a tenement museum in New York. That is fascinating. That's fascinating to walk through and to be enveloped in that environment. And you get a sense, at least some sense of what they went through.
You know, another thing, another point along that point, Julie, is the ingenuity of people who lacked the formal education, and often their ingenuity was copied by those people who had the formal ingenuity, and then you think, oh, that guy, he was really so smart, but all he did was walk around the country. It's like the people who travel around the world and see all the different technologies that people have, problems that people have worked out, then they bring it back, put their brand on it, and they say, look how smart those guys are. So, you know, that guy he didn't discover that. You know, they just saw somebody else doing it. I want to stop here and ask, are there any questions from our esteemed panel here, of anybody who's on the call, or you know, this Zoom conference? Do you have any questions or comments about what has been explored so far?
I'd like to make a comment if I could. I just appreciate all three of our Julie, Christina, and Jack, everything that you said. And I just especially appreciate the comment about, you know, when we think about history and when we walk into these museums and see all of these artifacts and the stories that go along with those, just again, to have that broader perspective of, at the very least, we always want to make sure that all of the people, about whom these museums are representing, that they do have their own perspective set forth. It's just something that, again, I think human nature, a lot of times, even the stories that are written about people tend to be written from specific perspectives, and it's not always something at the forefront of people's minds to make sure that all the various perspectives of all the stakeholders, if you will, are included. So I really appreciate that emphasis. So thank you.
And along those same lines, I'll comment something that Julie said about, looking through our present lens and looking at things in the past through our present lens. And relative to what you just said, Colby, is looking through some of the opposition too. Because even when you go back and you say, oh, looking through that person's lens, it looked like this, but they had opposition, and those people's lens often are neglected too. So it's like, if you look, you can go back as far as like even people before the period of Christ, and you have people talking about human rights, and you have people talking about the like how slavery and how mistreatment of people just isn't right. Even way before Christ, people were, you have commentary on that. So if you look through those lenses also, those are also historical lenses that people tend to overlook and make it look like, well, everybody thought that way. Everybody didn't think that way. The people who won the war thought that way, and then they wrote the history. So I think those are important things also that a museum can help us to bring out. Anybody else have?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, I grew up just east of Madison, and I was back a year ago. And I now live in Windsor, Wisconsin, just outside of Madison, Wisconsin. And I was back doing research on a writing project that I'm involved in right now on the campus about a year ago. And I was doing my research at the Munt Library, and I was surprised when I got there at the condition that I encountered. I can remember being back there, and the lower floor had a number of very interesting artifacts from his career, and they were all gone. They were not displayed, and I was told they were just all put back in storage when the foundation sort of liquidated their responsibilities in the library, etc. I'm wondering if the Lake County Library, which I wanted to visit, but I did my research on a Friday morning, and 1 o'clock Friday afternoon, the Lake County Museum wasn't open, and so I missed getting back in there to see the new version of that. But I'm wondering if those of you that are on from the Lake County Museum have made any overtures to the Munt Foundation people to review those artifacts and look at what might be involved in the Lake County Museum, since she was such a presence, politically from the Madison area.
Yes. We do have some artifacts, but we haven't talked to the Munt Library about getting the artifacts either, because we're extremely limited on storage and display. And they're being housed right now in a good location. But I think you're absolutely right, and that's what I was actually just thinking about this the other day. Mary Munt, Mrs. Munt was very interesting and very important in her own right. Mm-hmm. And how do we, I'd like to tell her story. And how do we tell her story, and where are we going to start, and where will we take it? But we definitely partner with DSU and the Carl Munt Library. Their archivist is on our board, on the museum's board. So I think that would be a very interesting project.
Great.
Thank you.
May I ask
Excellent.
one other thing? And
Yeah,
do
sure.
you relate to the museum at Prairie Village at all? I asked that question rather personally because my aunt was the central operator at Wentworth, South Dakota. And they have the building at Prairie Village, but I have the switchboard from that building as well as several other artifacts that were very much a part of her office when that was functioning. And I wondered if you do business with them or are you distinctly separate?
No, we definitely try to partner with some projects. We talk back and forth, the director and I, and then also Jack. We've sat down and had conversations about potential exhibits. So we do want to partner with them more, but we are very distinct, different entities,
Right.
and we we view collections differently. They're more of a living history museum, and we're more of a traditional. Our goal is we need to preserve and properly collect and interpret. I love living history museums, but their missions are a little different, you know.
Right. I
So
get that.
yeah.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank
I
you.
understand. Thanks.
So I would like to go into the support of the museum because I think we've given at least a taste of kind of what they are. I still think there's lots more to be said about what they could be and where you're trying to take things. But I would be remiss without talking about how we, the general public, can help further your mission. Now, Jack talked about the huge number of people who are volunteers who apparently are critical to their survival because with that rate of participation, I don't know how you can avoid that. That view that they're critical to the survival of museums. But can you talk about all of the different ways that people could contribute to the health and the progress of museums, even if they're vinegar museums?
I think, people contribute to museums in different ways. I mean, we have memberships, that helps fund us. Of course, funding is extremely important for all nonprofits, as we're well aware of, but museums also are there to give opportunities to volunteers, to people of all ages. We've got high school students to college students and retired folks who all contribute their time and talents to museums. And that's what also a service that we provide, but it's also important for the community to help us and to help us and to participate like we're doing today. We want to hear the ideas of the public. We want them to come to our programs, to come into the museum. Just coming in is extremely important. That helps. Like, I think, Lawrence, on our previous conversation, we talked about funding and how do we quantify our worth to a community. And museums, we have to do that in a number of different ways. We count the number of people who come into the museum, who attend program, what kind of donations are we getting, how many memberships do we have? We quantify our volunteer time, even though that's extremely difficult to do.
Can you talk a little bit about that, Julie?
Yes. Yep.
Good.
So we have, I have 8 volunteers, and they're averaging about 90 hours per month. So we quantify it by how much time they're giving, and also each state has an hourly wage calculated for the for volunteers. So in South Dakota, it's like $25 an hour, $25.25 an hour. And that's something that I track, because that's something that people understand too. Oh, this is the quote unquote monetary value of a volunteer. Well, there's so many other things that volunteers bring to an organization. I mean, it's research, and like Jack is one of our go-to people for staff and volunteers with all of his previous experience, museum knowledge, history, but just even life experience. To quantify that is difficult. You know, you can't, so that's the only way that we can do it, through hours and that monetary hourly value.
Right. It's, I find trying to calculate volunteer hours, it's an interesting thing. And as we've discussed, for lots of reasons, you end up having to come up with a number. But it's kind of like those insurance things, like when the military blows up somebody's house and they say, well, how do we calculate how much those people are worth? I mean, just the idea of it is like repugnant. But at the same time, if you say, well, you're going to compensate people, you end up having to come up with that number,
Right.
So you say, well, how do you calculate the value of a person's life? How do you calculate the value that a volunteer brings, especially if you get somebody who has unique experiences that relative to your museum mission? How can you calculate that? I mean, and the value is also relative to who comes in and takes advantage of that value. So there's the value of the patron too, in terms of your total mission. So those are all considerations. What are some of the things that people can do in terms of getting your message out and helping you to bring people into the museum? Have you thought about how people might do that?
Yes.
Other than coming themselves?
Yeah. No, word of mouth, join our Facebook page, go on our website, share it with your friends. Just get our newsletter, become a member, all, volunteer, but yeah, just connecting with us. You could be in any state, like Terry, you're in Wisconsin. We've got members from all over the country. Word of mouth is, I think, some of our best advertisement. Definitely.
I would like to add a couple of things, because we're running out of time now, and I want to get that idea out there. People have like book clubs, and they have like study groups and things like that. We need more of those in South Dakota. We need more people to be woke, so to speak, to be aware of what's happening around you. And the way to do that is get some of your friends together and go to a tour of museums, because people are often sitting around, I ain't got nothing to do, it's boring here. No, just get your people together, and you can, take a trip to museums. Back in the day, we had a few deaths in Roslyn that kind of disrupted the trend. But we used to have a regular, once a month, we would all get together and go, instead of going to coffee at our local place, the people who did coffee, we would go to another town to have coffee, because we knew everybody was having coffee about the same time. We get in our cars and we just go to those people, mostly just to watch the reaction on their face when strangers came to town for coffee. But it's the whole idea of like going to see, well, what's that town like? What's their coffee like? So if you could make an entertaining, and we did have conversations about it too. If you could have that as an entertainment venue, something to do in your town, if you can get together and go to different museums in various towns, that could be as interesting as a book club, and it
Yeah.
could be a thing in your town, and you have something that you mutually experience together. That's invaluable. You know,
It is.
and it really it really can bring your community together. And if you do it with some of your friends and you tell people that you did it, you'd be surprised at how quickly a good idea spreads around.
We're a
Well,
great place to bring kids too.
yes, exactly. Uh, we're down to our last seconds here. Anything you want to close with, Julie? And by the way, thanks, Abigail. And we're going to get Abigail to come in and talk about the South Dakota State Art Museum here too pretty soon. Get her on the talk because they're doing some interesting things as well. Any closing statements that you'd like to make, Julie?
Yes. Once again, thank you for having us on the program today. Thank you for South Dakota Humanities Council for our grant for the claim shanty. I do want to tell everybody's invited. Next Tuesday, November 1st, we are having our claim shanty exhibit opening, and we're having a speaker, Laura Hovey-Newbert. She's going to be talking about women homesteaders in the early 20th century. At 6:30, we start with a social, and you'll be able to visit with our speaker, and then she'll start talking and discussing her topic at 7 o'clock. And we are located in Madison on the DSU campus.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank everybody for showing up and interacting with us. We look forward to another exciting adventure in the near future. In fact, next Thursday, same time, same station. All right. See
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.